I realized my son's future father-in-law had been mocking me in French for nearly an hour when he raised his wine glass, smiled at me across the dinner table, and said, "At least Ethan inherited ambition from his mother." The worst part wasn't that I understood every word. The worst part was realizing my own son had become so desperate to belong in their world that he didn't even notice they were humiliating both of us right in front of him. My name is Thomas Bennett. I'm 64 years old, retired, widowed, and until about 6 months ago, I honestly believed the most interesting parts of my life were already behind me. That sounds depressing when you say it out loud, but I don't think it felt depressing at the time. I think it felt practical. Like something a man quietly accepts after enough years pass. You reach a certain age and people stop asking who you are. They only ask what you used to do. I used to be a journalist. Then I used to be a husband. Then I used to be a father with a busy household. And eventually, after enough time and enough loss, you become a man standing alone in the grocery store comparing soup prices at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning because there's nobody at home waiting for you anymore. That was my life before Ethan called me in February and told me he was getting married. I was in my kitchen in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin at the time. Snow everywhere outside. Coffee going cold beside me. I remember because I had just burned toast and was standing there scraping charcoal into the sink when my phone rang. "Dad," he said immediately, and I could hear the excitement in his voice before he even finished the sentence. I proposed. I leaned against the counter and laughed. "Well, did she say yes or did you panic halfway through?" "She said yes." There was this pause afterward. A happy pause. The kind where you can hear someone smiling through the phone. I closed my eyes for a second and pictured him at 8 years old running through the backyard with a plastic sword, absolutely convinced he was going to become either an astronaut or Batman depending on the day. "Congratulations, kid," I said quietly. Ethan was 34 then. Financial consultant turned startup partner. Lived in Manhattan now. Expensive suits. Business dinners. The kind of life that requires calendars synced across 3 devices and conversations about market positioning. Sometimes when he talked about work, I honestly had no idea what he was saying anymore. But he sounded successful. Confident. Important. And I was proud of him for that. His fiancée's name was Camille Laurent. I'd only met her twice before the engagement, but she was beautiful in that polished kind of way that made you instinctively straighten your posture around her. French-American. Worked in luxury branding. Came from money. Serious money. Not loud money. Quiet money. The dangerous kind. Her family owned investment firms, vineyards, commercial properties across Europe. The kind of people who didn't talk about wealth because they'd had it for so long they no longer considered it unusual. Meanwhile, I taught American history to high school students for 31 years. So yes, there was a difference there. But Camille herself had always been pleasant to me. Reserved, maybe. Hard to read. But pleasant. The first time we met, she shook my hand and said, "Ethan talks about you constantly." I remember joking, hopefully only the legal stories. She smiled politely. Not warmly. Just politely. At the time I assumed she was nervous. Now I think she was evaluating me. That's the thing about certain wealthy families. They don't enter rooms emotionally. They enter rooms strategically. You don't notice it at first because they're too well-mannered to appear rude. But eventually you realize every conversation feels like an interview you didn't know you were taking. A few weeks after the engagement, Ethan invited me to Vermont for a long weekend with Camille's family. Her parents had rented this massive estate near Stowe to celebrate the engagement privately before the official party in New York later that spring. "It'll be good for everyone to spend time together," Ethan told me. I should probably explain something here. My son loved me. I never doubted that. But somewhere over the last 5 or 6 years, our relationship had changed in ways neither of us really talked about directly. After my wife Susan died from ovarian cancer, Ethan started treating me carefully. Like I was fragile. At first it came from kindness. Then gradually it became something else. Concern. Correction. Embarrassment. Not openly. Ethan wasn't cruel. That almost would have been easier. Instead it came out in small moments. Dad, you probably shouldn't wear that jacket to dinner. Dad, these people are kind of formal. Dad, maybe don't bring up politics tonight. Little things. Tiny adjustments. Tiny edits. Like he was trying to smooth the rough edges off me before presenting me to the world. And if I'm being honest, after Susan died, I let him. Grief does strange things to a man. It shrinks him. Susan had been the social one. The connective tissue of the family. The person who remembered birthdays and fixed awkward silences and somehow made every room warmer simply by entering it. After she was gone, I stopped traveling. Stopped seeing old friends. Stopped talking much at all unless someone directly asked me a question. I retired from teaching 2 years later because the classroom suddenly felt too loud and too empty at the same time. My world got smaller. I think Ethan noticed that happening before I did. And once people start seeing you as small, it becomes dangerously easy to help them believe it. The drive to Vermont took almost 5 hours. Snow melting along the highways. Gray skies overhead. I remember listening to old jazz radio most of the way there because silence in the car had started feeling heavier recently. When I finally pulled into the Loran estate, I actually laughed out loud. Estate really was the correct word. This wasn't a vacation home. It looked like the kind of place senators go to have affairs. Massive stone exterior. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. Staff bringing luggage inside before I'd even turned off the engine. I stepped out of my Subaru feeling immediately underdressed despite wearing the nicest coat I owned. A younger man in a navy sweater approached first. "Thomas," he asked. I nodded. He smiled quickly and extended his hand. Julian Loran. Camille's brother. Tall. Sharp jawline. Expensive watch. The exact type of man magazines describe as effortlessly successful. His handshake lasted half a second too long. Not enough to seem aggressive. Just enough to establish dominance. "Long drive?" he asked. "Long enough." He glanced briefly at my car. Then back at me. Tiny smile. Again, not rude enough to confront. Just enough to register. That family specialized in moments like that. Inside the house, everything smelled faintly of cedar wood and expensive candles. Camille greeted me with an air kiss near the fireplace while Ethan hugged me properly. That part mattered more than I expected. "You made it," Ethan said. "Barely. Your future in-laws appear to own a small country." He laughed nervously instead of genuinely. That should have told me something too. Victor Loran entered the room about 10 minutes later. Camille's father. Tall man. Mid-60s. Silver hair. Perfect posture. The kind of face that looked permanently disappointed by modern civilization. He shook my hand firmly. "Thomas," he said. "Welcome." His accent was subtle but unmistakably French. Behind him came Camille's mother, Elise. Elegant. Controlled. Beautiful in an intimidating way. Susan used to describe women like that as women who never sweat in airports. Elise smiled at me warmly enough to seem gracious. But there was distance in it. Distance everywhere. The first hour actually went fairly well. Drinks near the fireplace. Casual conversation. Stories about Ethan and Camille meeting in Manhattan. Victor mostly ignored me except for occasional polite questions about Wisconsin or retirement. The conversation naturally drifted toward business, travel, art galleries, investment trends in Europe. Areas where I had nothing useful to contribute. So I listened. And honestly, I was fine with that. I'd gotten used to listening over the years. Dinner started around 7. Long wooden table overlooking the mountains. Candlelight everywhere. Snow falling outside the windows. Beautiful enough to belong in a movie. And that was when everything changed. At some point during the appetizers, Ethan left the table briefly to answer a work call outside. Camille followed him a minute later. which left me sitting across from Victor, Julian, and Elise. Victor swirled wine in his glass and said something quietly in French. Julian laughed immediately. Elise smiled into her drink. And just like that, after 30 years of barely speaking the language out loud, old instincts snapped awake inside my head. I understood every word. He has kind eyes, Elise said in French. But he looks completely lost here. Victor smirked faintly. He's a retired schoolteacher from Wisconsin, he replied. Of course he's lost here. Julian added, at least Ethan inherited ambition from his mother. They all chuckled softly. I sat completely still. Now here's the part that matters. Most people think moments like that feel explosive immediately. Like rage or humiliation hitting all at once. But honestly, at first it felt surreal. Like accidentally overhearing strangers talk about someone else who happened to have your face. Because these people truly believed I couldn't understand them. There was no performance in their cruelty. No hesitation. Just honesty. And honest contempt is always colder than deliberate cruelty. Victor continued speaking while cutting into his steak. Ethan is intelligent, he said in French. But he still seeks approval too much. Men raised in smaller lives often do. Smaller lives. That phrase landed harder than the others. Because the truth is, part of me already feared it might be true. I took a sip of wine carefully. Steady hand. Steady breathing. 30 years ago in Marseille, I'd learned quickly that understanding people without their knowledge was a dangerous kind of power. Especially as a journalist. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe nobody important is listening. Victor leaned back slightly. He'll grow out of it after the marriage, he said. Especially once the business partnership is finalized. That caught my attention immediately. Julian nodded. Assuming he signs everything before summer. He will, Victor replied calmly. Camille knows how to guide him. Guide him. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Then Julian glanced toward me. In fairness, he said in French, the father seems harmless enough. Victor actually smiled at that. Yes, he agreed. Harmless. I wish I could explain exactly what that word did to me. Not because it was insulting. Because it was accurate. Or at least it described the version of me I had slowly allowed myself to become. Harmless. Widowed teacher. Quiet retiree. Men who apologized when waiters brought him the wrong order. Men who stopped correcting people when they underestimated him because correcting them required energy he no longer had. The thing is, Victor Laurent would have been shocked to meet me at 28. Back then I lived in Marseille covering labor protests and political corruption for an English-language newspaper nobody remembers anymore. I once got punched outside a dockworkers' union office after publishing an investigation involving shipping contracts tied to organized crime. I spoke French every single day for almost a decade. Fast French. Angry French. Street French. The kind no classroom teaches you. Then I met Susan during a summer trip back to Chicago. And eventually journalism became teaching because teaching was stable and stability mattered once children entered the picture. Then years passed. Then more years. Then suddenly your son is introducing you to billionaires and you realize the most dangerous thing about aging isn't wrinkles or bad knees. It's how easy it becomes to disappear slowly while still technically remaining alive. Ethan and Camille returned a few minutes later. Conversation immediately switched back to English. Like flipping a light switch. Victor smiled warmly at his daughter. Julian started discussing skiing conditions. Nobody at the table gave the slightest indication anything unusual had happened. That was the moment I understood exactly what kind of family this was. Not dramatic people. Controlled people. And controlled people are often far more dangerous. The rest of dinner passed in this strange split reality where two conversations existed simultaneously. English above the table. French beneath it. Polite questions in one language. Real opinions in the other. At one point Elise complimented Ethan's intelligence in English while quietly telling Victor in French that Ethan still dressed like an ambitious intern trying to imitate wealthy men. Later Julian joked with Ethan about New York traffic while privately asking Victor whether Ethan fully understood the legal terms attached to the upcoming business merger. Victor simply replied, "He understands enough." That sentence stayed with me. He understands enough. Not everything. Enough. By dessert, I had stopped feeling personally insulted. Instead, I became deeply uncomfortable for my son. Because Ethan sat there smiling, trying so hard to impress these people, completely unaware they viewed him less like future family and more like a promising acquisition. And the worst part? I wasn't sure anymore whether Camille saw the difference. Around 10 that night, everyone migrated toward the fireplace with drinks. Snow falling heavier outside now. Jazz playing softly through hidden speakers somewhere in the house. Ethan looked happy. That's what complicated everything. He genuinely loved Camille. You could see it every time he looked at her. And she did seem to care about him in her own way. But love and power become dangerous together when one person values acceptance more than equality. At some point Ethan stepped upstairs to take another call. Julian followed shortly after, leaving me alone briefly with Victor near the fireplace. He handed me a whiskey. Expensive stuff. I accepted it. For a moment we stood there silently watching snow fall beyond the windows. Then Victor said in English, "Ethan is a very capable man." He is. He'll do well with proper guidance. There was something deliberate about the phrasing now. Almost probing. I looked at him carefully. And suddenly I understood something. Victor Laurent didn't see himself as a villain. Men like him never do. He genuinely believed he was elevating Ethan. Refining him. Improving him. In his mind, families like mine produced good raw material. Families like his turned that material into significance. That realization made me strangely sad more than angry. Because people who think that way rarely notice the damage they cause. Victor sipped his whiskey. "You must be proud," he said. "I am." He nodded slowly. "You gave him a stable foundation." Foundation. Interesting word choice. "And now?" I asked quietly. Victor glanced toward the staircase where Ethan had disappeared. "Now he builds upward." There it was. Not even hidden anymore. Small town father builds foundation. Wealthy family builds the future. I smiled faintly into my drink. And for one dangerous second, I almost answered him in French. Almost. Instead I simply nodded. But something inside me had already changed. Because for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible. I felt awake. And those are very different things. Later that night, lying awake in the enormous guest bedroom they'd prepared for me, I stared at snow sliding down the windows and replayed everything I'd heard over dinner. Especially one sentence. Once the business partnership is finalized. Not wedding. Not marriage. Partnership. There was a business angle underneath all of this. Something bigger than family approval. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, while the entire house slept, I realized something that made my chest feel unexpectedly tight. These people thought I was harmless because my son did. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. But somewhere over the years, Ethan had unconsciously learned to see me as a smaller version of myself. And maybe that was partly my fault. Maybe if you spend enough years acting invisible, eventually even the people who love you stop looking closely. I rolled over in bed and stared into the darkness for a long time after that. Because for the first time since arriving in Vermont, I wasn't thinking about insults anymore. I was thinking about why a wealthy French businessman seemed so confident my son would sign something he didn't fully understand. And why suddenly, after years of feeling emotionally retired from the world, I could feel old instincts waking back up inside me again. I barely slept that first night in Vermont. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Victor Laurent's voice repeating the same sentence in calm, effortless French. Once the business partnership is finalized, not marriage. Not family. Partnership. There's a difference between those words, and men like Victor never choose words accidentally. Around 6 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep and went downstairs. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of heating vents and the sound of wind pushing snow against the windows. I made coffee in the enormous marble kitchen as carefully as possible, trying not to wake anyone, though judging by the size of the place, I probably could have hosted a marching band in there without disturbing the upstairs bedrooms. I was halfway through my second cup when Camille walked in wearing cream-colored lounge clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment back in Wisconsin. She looked mildly surprised to see me awake. "You're up early," she said. "Old man bladder," I replied. "One of God's crueler design choices." To my surprise, she laughed. A real laugh this time, not one of those careful social smiles she usually wore around me. For a brief second she actually looked younger, less controlled. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out sparkling water, then leaned against the counter. "Ethan said you used to wake up at 5 even on weekends." "Teacher habit," I said. "Teenagers can smell weakness if you arrive tired." Another small smile. Then silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable exactly, but measured. Everything around Camille felt measured. After a moment she asked, "How are you liking Vermont?" "Beautiful place. My father likes environments where he can control the guest list." That caught my attention immediately. She said it casually while unscrewing the bottle cap, but there was something underneath the sentence. Something sharper. "That sounds oddly honest," I said carefully. Camille shrugged. "You get older, you stop pretending your parents are mysterious." Then she glanced at me. "I hope they haven't overwhelmed you." There it was again. That word choice. Overwhelmed. Not welcomed. Not entertained. Overwhelmed. Like she already knew exactly how her family came across to people outside their world. I decided to test something. "Your father seems very invested in Ethan's future." Camille took a sip of water before answering. "My father is invested in everything." The way she said it made me think of a warning label hidden inside a compliment. Before I could respond, footsteps sounded upstairs and the moment disappeared. By 7:30 everyone was gathered for breakfast. Julian arrived last wearing an expensive quarter-zip sweater and the expression of a man irritated by the existence of mornings. Victor was already reading financial news on his tablet while Elise discussed afternoon plans with Camille. Ethan sat beside me looking tired. "You sleep okay?" I asked quietly. "Not really." "Work stuff. Everything all right?" "Yeah. Just partnership negotiations." There was that word again. Partnership. Victor glanced up briefly from his tablet. Important opportunities require temporary discomfort. Ethan nodded almost immediately. Right. I watched that exchange carefully. It wasn't fear exactly. But there was pressure there. The kind that hides itself beneath admiration. After breakfast, the group split up for the day. Elise and Camille planned spa appointments in town while Victor invited Ethan and Julian to a nearby country club to discuss future strategy. The phrase sounded less like golf and more like military planning. Then Victor turned toward me with polite hesitation. "Thomas," he said, "you're welcome to join us, of course, though I suspect golf may not be your preferred way to spend an afternoon." Harmless. Small town. Predictable. I smiled. "You suspect correctly." Ethan looked relieved about that, though he tried not to show it. That stung more than I expected. After they left, I stayed behind at the estate alone for several hours. And that was probably the moment this entire story truly began. Because without distractions or conversation, my mind started assembling pieces together whether I wanted it to or not. I sat near the fireplace staring at snowfall outside while old instincts slowly returned. Journalism teaches you something dangerous after enough years. People rarely hide the truth completely. They scatter it carelessly across conversations, gestures, timing, legal language. Most lies aren't hidden. They're simply buried beneath confidence. Victor Laurent was too intelligent to behave recklessly. Which meant whatever he was building around Ethan likely existed in plain sight if someone knew where to look. Around noon, curiosity finally outweighed manners. I pulled out my phone and started researching. At first everything looked pristine. Laurent Holdings. European investments. Luxury hospitality acquisitions. Renewable infrastructure. Articles in financial magazines. Charity galas. Political connections. Old money wrapped in modern branding. But polished reputations often crack at the edges if you look long enough. So I kept digging. And eventually I found Julien. Specifically, I found 2 failed partnerships buried beneath layers of corporate restructuring. Both involved smaller tech firms absorbed into Laurent-controlled investment agreements. In both cases, the original founders lost controlling interest within 3 years. Legally, everything appeared clean. Ethically, that depended entirely on how much power you thought wealthy families should have over ambitious younger men trying to enter their orbit. One article from a European financial blog caught my attention especially. It described Julien as highly effective at identifying emotionally motivated founders eager for elite financial access. Emotionally motivated founders. Jesus Christ. They talked about human beings like acquisition targets. I kept reading. Lawsuits quietly settled. Former partners disappearing professionally afterward. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just systematic imbalance disguised as mentorship. And suddenly Ethan's exhausted face at breakfast made perfect sense. He thought he was joining a powerful family. In reality, they were evaluating whether he was useful enough to absorb. Around 3 in the afternoon, the others returned from town while Victor's group remained at the country club. Camille found me alone in the library pretending to read a history book I hadn't absorbed a single word from. "You disappeared," she said. "I didn't realize I was required entertainment." "You're not." She sat across from me. "My family can be intense. That's a diplomatic word. I grew up around diplomats." Again, that almost smile. I studied her carefully then. Because the truth was, I still hadn't decided whether Camille herself was part of the problem or simply adapted to surviving inside it. "There's a difference." "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Of course." "Do you think Ethan changes around us?" Interesting question. Very interesting question. I closed the book slowly. "I think your family matters to him." That wasn't my question. There it was again. Directness hiding beneath elegance. I considered lying. Decided against it. "Yes," I said finally. "I think he wants very badly to impress all of you." Camille looked down briefly at her hands. "He does that with everyone he respects." That sounds exhausting. It is. For the first time since meeting her, I saw genuine tiredness in her expression. Not weakness exactly. More like someone carrying expectations heavy enough to permanently alter posture. She looked toward the snowy windows. "You know, people assume wealth removes pressure. Usually it just changes its shape." Then she stood smoothly before I could answer. "Dinner's at 7. And just like that, the wall returned. That evening turned worse. Not openly. Quietly. Which somehow made it feel more suffocating. Victor and Julien drank too much wine during dinner and became careless again in French. Only now the comments shifted beyond me toward Ethan himself. Julien asked whether Ethan fully understood the revised ownership structure attached to the upcoming merger. Victor replied calmly that understanding wasn't necessary if trust existed. Ethan laughed politely, assuming they were discussing something else entirely. I sat there feeling physically sick. Because trust was exactly what made men vulnerable to people like the Laurents. They relied on admiration the way magicians rely on distraction. At one point Ethan excused himself to take another work call upstairs. The second he disappeared, Julien muttered in French, "He works constantly because he still thinks exhaustion proves worth." Elise sighed lightly. Americans romanticize overwork. Victor cut into his steak carefully. Ambition is useful. Insecurity is even more useful. I nearly looked up at that. Nearly. But years of interviewing corrupt. The rest of that weekend in Vermont passed with the strange emotional tension of a dinner party where only one person realizes the house is slowly filling with smoke. Nobody screamed. Nobody fought. The Laurents were too disciplined for open conflict. That family operated through atmosphere instead. Pressure disguised as sophistication. Control disguised as generosity. By Sunday afternoon, Ethan was already talking about flying back to New York early to prepare for meetings connected to the partnership deal, and Victor looked pleased in the quiet, restrained way wealthy men often do when events unfold exactly as expected. Before I left, Camille hugged me near the front entrance while snow melted softly from the roof gutters outside. "Thank you for coming," she said. It meant a lot to Ethan. I looked at her for a moment, trying to decide something I still couldn't fully answer. Whether she understood what her father was doing. Whether she had become so accustomed to her family's version of power that she no longer recognized manipulation when it wore expensive clothing and spoke calmly over wine. "Take care of him," I said quietly. Something flickered in her expression then. Briefly. Almost guilt. "I intend to," she replied. The drive back to Wisconsin felt longer than the drive there. Maybe because silence had changed shape. On the way to Vermont, I'd mostly been worrying about embarrassment. Whether I'd fit in. Whether I'd say the wrong thing. Whether Ethan would spend the weekend apologizing for me internally every time I opened my mouth. But on the drive home, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that my son was walking into something dangerous while believing he was walking upward. And worse than that, he trusted the people leading him there. 3 days later, Ethan called me around 9 at night. I could hear Manhattan traffic faintly in the background. "You home?" he asked. "At my age?" "Absolutely not. I'm currently clubbing in Miami." He laughed distractedly. "Sorry. Dumb question. Long day. Long week." He sounded exhausted again. There was a hesitation before he continued. "Listen, Camille's family is hosting an engagement gala in Manhattan next month. Big formal thing. Investors, family friends, people from Europe. Camille really wants you there." "Does Camille want me there or does Camille want Ethan not upset with her for excluding me?" Silence. Tiny silence. But enough. "Dad, I'm kidding. Mostly." Another pause. Then he sighed. "I know Vermont was probably uncomfortable. Uncomfortable isn't fatal. They can be intense. You keep using that word. Because it's true." I leaned back in my chair and stared out at the frozen lake behind my house. "Ethan, can I ask you something honestly?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" Immediate answer. Too immediate. "Of course." That wasn't what I asked. Silence again. Longer this time. "I love Camille," he said finally. That's not the same answer. His tone shifted slightly then, irritation mixing with fatigue. "What exactly are you trying to say?" "I think you've spent the last 6 months auditioning for a life you already convinced yourself you need. You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not. But I know what tired looks like." He exhaled sharply. "Dad, with respect, you don't understand how these worlds work." There it was again. Those worlds. As if he'd crossed some invisible border between ordinary people and the elite. "You're right," I said calmly. "I only spent 10 years interviewing politicians, labor organizers, shipping executives, and corrupt businessmen in southern France. What would I know about wealthy people manipulating perception?" Dead silence. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. Damn it. That had slipped out farther than I intended. Ethan sounded confused. "What?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Nothing. Forget it." "No, what are you talking about?" "Old life. Doesn't matter." "Dad, you taught high school." "Afterward." Another pause. "After what?" I should have stopped there. Probably would have been smarter. But something about the way Ethan kept speaking to me lately, as though my entire existence began in a Wisconsin classroom and ended beside a fishing dock, started bothering me more than I wanted to admit. "Before teaching," I said quietly, "I worked as a journalist in Marseille for several years." Silence. "You never told me that." "Never seemed important." "Dad, that's incredibly important." "Not really." "You lived in France." "For almost a decade." "You speak French." There it was. The question. Finally. I stared out the window at the dark lake. Fluently. The silence on the other end changed shape completely. Not confusion anymore. Shock. Wait, Ethan said slowly. At dinner in Vermont, yes. Another long silence. I could practically hear his brain replaying the entire weekend in real time. You understood them. Every word. Jesus Christ. His voice dropped lower. Why didn't you say anything? I laughed softly without humor. Honestly. At first I was curious. Curious. It's revealing, hearing what people say when they believe you're beneath understanding them. Dad, and after a while, I realized your future father-in-law was discussing your business deal more honestly in French than anyone ever was in English. Silence again. Then, what exactly did they say? Now came the dangerous part. Because once truth enters a family, it rarely arrives neatly. Victor believes you're emotionally eager for validation, I said carefully. He thinks that makes you manageable. Ethan didn't speak. Julian discussed ownership structures attached to the partnership. They repeatedly referenced control after signatures were finalized. That's impossible. Is it? Camille would never. I didn't say Camille. Another pause. Then more quietly, you think they're trying to manipulate me. I think wealthy families often confuse control with mentorship. Ethan sounded genuinely unsettled now. Why are you only telling me this now? Because I needed to be certain before I interfered in your life. And now? Now I think you should have an independent lawyer review every document before you sign anything. I already have lawyers. Your lawyers or theirs? He didn't answer. Which was answer enough. We ended the call awkwardly after that. No yelling. No dramatic confrontation. Just tension. Ethan promising to look things over carefully. Me pretending that was enough reassurance. But the second I hung up, I knew two things immediately. First, Ethan had started doubting them. Second, doubt would make the Lawrence dangerous. Because families built on power rarely tolerate uncertainty gracefully. 2 weeks later I arrived in Manhattan for the engagement gala. And I knew within 30 seconds that Vermont had merely been the audition. The actual performance was happening here. The event was held at a private rooftop venue overlooking Midtown. Glass walls. Black marble floors. Soft jazz. Staff carrying champagne like synchronized dancers. Every person there looked expensive in a way that felt almost architectural. Men with silver hair and watches worth small mortgages. Women wearing dresses so understated they somehow became intimidating. I stepped out of the elevator in a dark navy suit Ethan had convinced me to buy beforehand because apparently my normal suits looked too academic. I still wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Ethan greeted me near the entrance looking exhausted beneath his smile. You made it. You sound surprised. No, just, he glanced around nervously. There are a lot of people here. I noticed. He adjusted his tie again. Third time in 30 seconds. You okay? I asked quietly. Yeah. Just stressed. How much sleep are you getting? Enough. Which usually means not enough. Before I could push further, Camille approached in a dark emerald dress that turned heads every time she moved through the room. She kissed Ethan quickly, then greeted me politely. But there was tension underneath her composure tonight. Tiny signs most people wouldn't notice. Slight stiffness in her shoulders. Careful eye contact. Controlled breathing. Ethan had told her. Maybe not everything. But enough. Thomas, she said warmly. I'm glad you came. Would have hated missing the coronation. Her smile faltered for half a second before recovering. Open bars to your left. Now that's hospitality. She moved away toward another group almost immediately. Ethan watched her go. You really need to stop doing that. Doing what? Making little comments. I made one. Victor stopped about 6 feet away from us, champagne glass still in hand, expression composed enough that most people in the room would have assumed nothing unusual was happening. That was his real talent. Not manipulation. Containment. The ability to maintain social equilibrium while quietly tightening pressure underneath it. Ethan looked trapped between us, shoulders tense, jaw tight. "Everything all right?" Victor repeated calmly. I watched him for another second before answering. "Actually," I said, "I was just asking Ethan whether he fully understands the revised governance structure attached to your partnership agreement." The shift in Victor's face lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was there. Tiny tightening around the eyes. The emotional equivalent of a card player briefly revealing he recognizes the hand sitting across from him. Ethan looked between us immediately. "What revised governance structure?" Victor's smile returned almost instantly. "Business language sounds more dramatic than it is." "Does he lose voting control after year 2? I asked. Directly this time. No softness left in it. Ethan stared at Victor. What? A few nearby conversations had started thinning out around us now. Nothing dramatic yet, but people notice tension instinctively at events like these. Especially wealthy people. They pretend not to stare while hearing absolutely everything. Victor lowered his glass carefully onto a nearby table. "Thomas," he said smoothly, "I'm not entirely sure what you believe you heard." Page 17, I interrupted. Expansion target contingencies tied to equity dilution. Ethan's face changed immediately. Not because he understood the clause yet, but because he recognized enough terminology to know I wasn't bluffing. "Victor," he asked quietly. Victor's tone remained calm, though colder now. "Those clauses are standard protective structures." "Protective for who?" I asked. "For everyone involved." "No," I said. "Mostly for you." Silence spread outward around us slowly. Not a scene yet. Just enough stillness that nearby guests began pretending to examine drinks or check phones while obviously listening. Ethan looked genuinely shaken now. "You told me the revised structure only affected international tax distribution." Victor's eyes stayed on me instead of Ethan. "Interesting choice. And this," he said carefully, "is why people without corporate experience shouldn't selectively interpret legal frameworks." Ah. There it was. Dismissal disguised as sophistication. Old strategy. Make the other person sound emotionally confused rather than factually dangerous. Normally it probably worked beautifully for him. Unfortunately for Victor, I spent most of my 20s interviewing politicians trained in the exact same rhetorical style. "Then explain it publicly," I said. "Right now." Ethan looked at Victor again. "Please." Victor smiled faintly. "This isn't the appropriate setting." "That depends," I replied, "on whether you plan to explain it before or after signatures happened." And that was the sentence that finally cracked the atmosphere completely. Victor's expression flattened. Not anger. Worse. Calculation. Behind him, I saw Julian approaching from across the room, already sensing trouble. Camille appeared near the terrace entrance at almost the same moment, eyes moving quickly between all of us. Ethan spoke again first. "Dad, what exactly are you saying?" I turned toward him fully then. "I'm saying your future father-in-law structured a partnership where failing aggressive expansion targets gives his family increased voting leverage over your company." Ethan stared at me. "That's not," he looked toward Victor again. "That's not true, right?" Victor answered too carefully. "It's more nuanced than that." Which, in business language, usually means yes. Ethan's face drained further. "You told me this was temporary protection until the European rollout stabilized." "It is." "Then why am I losing voting leverage?" Victor exhaled slowly through his nose. "Because control follows performance." There it was. Clean. Simple. Honest at last. Ethan blinked hard. "You said we were building this together." Victor's voice cooled further. "And we are." "No," I said quietly. "You're absorbing it." Julian arrived beside his father then, immediately reading the room with sharp eyes. "What's happening?" "Miscommunication," Victor replied instantly. But Julian looked directly at me and somehow understood everything anyway. "You told him," he said softly. Not asked. Said. I looked back at him evenly. "You told me first." That landed harder than I expected. Because Julian knew exactly what I meant. The French conversations. The private comments. The assumptions. His face shifted from confidence to disbelief almost immediately. "Wait," Camille said slowly, looking between us now. "What is he talking about?" I turned toward her. "I speak French." Complete silence. Real silence this time. Not social quiet. Shock. Julian actually laughed once under his breath. Not humor. More like disbelief at his own stupidity. Victor stared at me for several seconds without speaking. And for the first time since meeting him, I watched him lose control of a room. Not publicly. Internally. Tiny fracture in composure. "Since Vermont?" Camille asked quietly. "Since the first dinner." Her face went pale almost instantly. She looked toward her father, then Julian, then back at me again. "You understood everything?" Every word. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after that. Ethan looked physically sick. Victor recovered first, naturally. Men like him survive by recovering faster than everyone else. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "you should also explain context instead of selectively dramatizing private conversations." I almost admired the attempt. Almost. "All right," I said calmly. "Let's discuss context." More guests had gone quiet nearby now. Investors pretending not to stare. Couples subtly drifting closer under the disguise of conversation. Manhattan elite love scandal as long as it arrives wearing formal clothes. Should we discuss Julian describing Ethan as emotionally eager for validation? I asked. Or perhaps the part where you said men from smaller lives are easier to manage? Ethan's head snapped toward Victor immediately. Julian muttered something under his breath in French. "Careful," I replied automatically in the same language. "You're making assumptions again." That hit him harder than the English ever could have. Because suddenly the balance of power in the room had shifted completely. They no longer controlled the hidden conversation beneath the visible one. Camille looked horrified now. Not performatively. Genuinely horrified. "Dad," she whispered. Victor ignored her. His attention stayed locked on me. "You've turned private family commentary into theater." "No," I said evenly. "You turned my son into a project." Ethan looked like someone trying to wake himself from a dream. "Is any of this true?" he asked Victor quietly. "Did you actually say those things?" Victor hesitated. Fatal mistake. Just 1 second too long. Ethan saw it immediately. "Jesus Christ." Camille stepped toward Ethan quickly. "Listen to me, did you know?" Ethan asked her. She froze. Which was answer enough before she even spoke. "Not everything," she said carefully. "Camille." "I knew there were revised protections in the agreement, yes, but," Ethan stared at her like he'd never seen her properly before. "You let me walk into this." Her voice sharpened slightly now. "It wasn't malicious. You were going to let me sign control away. Temporarily. Without explaining it. Because you wouldn't have understood the long-term strategy emotionally." There it was. The sentence that killed the entire engagement. I saw it happen in Ethan's face in real time. Because suddenly all the tiny humiliations, corrections, pressures, and exhaustion finally aligned into one ugly picture. Not partnership. Management. Camille realized it too late. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "No," Ethan replied quietly. "I think it is." Victor stepped forward then, voice lower now, more dangerous. "This conversation should happen privately." "Why?" I asked. "Because public perception matters to you." Victor's eyes finally hardened completely. "You've humiliated my family tonight." "No," I said. "Your family humiliated itself." I just translated. That line spread through the room like static electricity. Even people pretending not to listen visibly reacted. Julian looked furious now. "You self-righteous old," Julian, Elise snapped sharply from across the room. First time I'd heard genuine anger from her all evening. But it was too late. The room had changed sides emotionally already. Not because wealthy people suddenly cared about morality. Because they cared about weakness. And Victor Laurent suddenly looked vulnerable for the first time in decades. Ethan stepped backward slowly, rubbing one hand over his mouth. I need air. Camille moved after him immediately. Ethan, wait. No, he turned toward her finally, and the pain in his expression honestly made my chest hurt. I spent a year trying to prove myself to your family. Camille's eyes filled slightly. You didn't have to prove anything. Then why did I always feel like I was failing? Silence. Victor stepped in again. Emotions are escalating unnecessarily. Ethan laughed once. Sharp. Bitter. That's your problem. Everything becomes strategy eventually. Because strategy prevents weakness. No, Ethan said quietly. It prevents honesty. Then he walked out toward the terrace alone. Camille stood frozen. Victor looked furious now beneath the composure, though only someone watching carefully would have noticed. His control wasn't gone. But it was cracking. I should have felt triumphant in that moment. Instead I mostly felt tired. Because revenge sounds satisfying in theory, but watching people you care about realize they built their future on something rotten is uglier than movies make it look. Elise approached slowly after several long seconds. Thomas, she said quietly, perhaps we should de-escalate this. I looked at her honestly. I tried. 4 weeks. And that was true. That's the part people never understand afterward. Nobody explodes first. Explosions are what happen after smaller warnings get ignored repeatedly. About 15 minutes later, guests started leaving in careful waves while pretending the evening had ended naturally. Rich people are experts at fleeing disasters politely. Victor disappeared briefly into a side office with Julian while Camille sat alone near the windows looking emotionally dismantled for the first time since I met her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because I did believe she loved Ethan in her own complicated way. But love without respect eventually becomes possession. Around midnight Ethan finally returned inside from the terrace. Eyes red. Face exhausted. He walked straight toward me. Did you really understand everything since Vermont? Yes. Why didn't you just tell me immediately? I considered that carefully before answering. Because you weren't ready to hear it yet. Ethan looked down at the floor for a long moment. You knew they looked down on you. Yes. And you still stayed quiet. At first because I didn't want to embarrass you. I paused. Then because I needed to know whether they looked down on you too. Ethan swallowed hard. I'm sorry. 2 simple words. But genuine. Completely genuine. I nodded slowly. I know. He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen since he was young. Not admiration exactly. Recognition. Like he'd suddenly discovered there was an entire human being standing behind the role of dad for the first time in years. You really worked in Marseille? He asked quietly. I laughed softly. That's somehow the detail you're stuck on. He shook his head. I don't know how I never knew any of this about you. You were busy becoming yourself. That's not an excuse. No. It wasn't. But I understood it anyway. Children spend most of their lives unconsciously believing their parents began existing at parenthood. They don't naturally imagine the versions that came before. Around 1 a.m, Camille approached us carefully. Ethan stiffened immediately beside me. She looked exhausted now too, makeup slightly worn, composure fraying around the edges. Can we talk? She asked him quietly. Ethan hesitated. Then nodded once. They disappeared into a side hallway together. I never learned exactly what was said between them that night. Only that Camille left the venue alone 40 minutes later with tears in her eyes while Victor watched from across the lobby without following her. That image stayed with me strangely. Not because I pitied Victor. But because for the first time, he looked old. Just old. Not powerful. Not commanding. Simply an aging man standing inside a collapsing plan. Before I left, Victor approached me one final time near the elevators. No audience now. No performance. Just the 2 of us. You enjoyed this, he said quietly. No, I answered honestly. I didn't. He studied my face carefully. Then why do it publicly? Because privately, you would have convinced him he imagined everything. That landed. He knew it too. You think you protected your son tonight, Victor said. I think I reminded him he wasn't for sale. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. You misunderstand ambition. No, I said softly. I misunderstand why some people confuse love with leverage. The elevator arrived behind me with a soft chime. Before stepping inside, I looked back at him one last time. You know the funniest part? I said. You spent weeks assuming I was harmless because I taught high school history in Wisconsin. Victor said nothing. But history, I continued, is mostly the study of powerful men underestimating people they considered smaller than themselves. Then the elevator doors closed. 3 weeks later Ethan came to Wisconsin. No announcement. No warning. I opened the front door and found him standing there holding coffee and looking like he hadn't slept properly since Manhattan. You gonna invite me in? He asked tiredly. Depends. You bringing decent coffee? He held up the carrier. I come prepared now. We sat near the lake for most of that afternoon talking more honestly than we had in years. About Susan. About France. About journalism. About how lonely he'd become trying to earn approval from people who treated vulnerability like weakness. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. The partnership deal died quietly after Ethan hired independent counsel to review everything thoroughly. Apparently several clauses were even worse than I realized. Camille called me once about a month later. Short conversation. She apologized. Not for the contract itself, interestingly. For allowing herself to normalize the way her family treated people. I don't think I noticed it happening anymore, she admitted quietly. That's usually how those environments work, I told her. I never spoke to Victor again. Which honestly felt appropriate. Some men don't need dramatic endings. Just distance. Early that spring, Ethan helped me renew my passport. We sat at my kitchen table filling out paperwork while rain tapped softly against the windows. Are you really going back to Marseille? He asked. Thinking about it. Why now? I smiled faintly. Because I spent too many years acting like the interesting parts of my life were already over. Ethan nodded slowly after that. Then he looked at me over the passport forms and said something I still think about sometimes. You know, he said quietly, for a while I honestly thought becoming successful meant becoming different from where I came from. I waited. He stared down at the paperwork for another second before continuing. Now I think maybe it's supposed to mean becoming more fully yourself instead. Outside, rain drifted across the lake in soft gray waves while the kitchen smelled faintly like coffee and old paper. And sitting there across from my son, listening to him speak with a kind of clarity I hadn't heard from him in years, I realized something unexpectedly simple. The most dangerous thing about being underestimated isn't the humiliation. It's the temptation to start underestimating yourself too. For a long time after Susan died, I'd quietly accepted becoming smaller because it felt easier than insisting on being fully seen. Easier to remain harmless. Easier to let people assume the story was already over. But stories don't end just because other people stop paying attention to them. Sometimes they wait quietly. Sometimes they sit dormant for years. And sometimes all it takes is one arrogant man speaking the wrong language at the wrong dinner table to remind you who you were before the world convinced you to disappear.